Hi, everyone. It's Caroline here again, and welcome to this week's podcast. In case we haven't met already, I've spent more than 20 years working across media, corporate communications, brand, and content strategy, and watching how work changes from the inside. Every week on this podcast and in the companion article, which I release on Substack, I unpack one topic that's reshaping work and what it means for you. So this week I want to dip my toes into the AI debate. So no, I don't want to talk about whether it's a good or bad thing for society. I think that's a whole other can of worms, and I don't want to get into that right here because I have separate thoughts on that. It's actually something else I've been thinking about the last couple of weeks, and it's the impact that AI has on two types of people or two types of job roles at work. So what we might call generalists and specialists. And the fact that potentially it might be creating a bit of an empathy gap between those two in some cases. Unfortunately, I don't know if we've actually noticed it's happening just yet. So let's get into it. Okay, just before I go any further, let's take a minute to define what I mean by specialist and what I mean by generalist, in case it's a bit of corporate type jargon that you haven't heard before. So I would call a specialist anyone who has spent most of their career or even their life potentially developing deep expertise in one craft or discipline. So they might be a writer or a software engineer or a graphic designer or even a lawyer in a particular area of law, potentially a scientist or even a musician as well. So when I talk about a generalist, that's someone who draws on a broader mix of skills to make their career work. So they might connect ideas or solve problems across disciplines, manage teams, make decisions without necessarily being the deepest expert in any one particular area. They might be good at particular things, but they're not really deep in one area. So I'm not saying that a specialist or generalist is better. And I think every organization needs both and should have both. And to be honest, most of us aren't 100% one or 100% the other. We're somewhere in the middle. Now, today, in the middle of my career, I'm actually one of those people who is probably more in the middle, or at least more than I used to be at the start of my career. So today I'm a communications leader. I run a business and I advise executives. But in my last role 5 years ago, I was the head of a communications and media department. So those are generalist skills. But underneath all of that, I'm a writer by trade. So it's my specialty and it's what I love doing. And for me, it's actually something personal as well as something I do professionally. So I've loved writing for as long as I can remember. I was reading pretty well at the age of 3. And after that, I always seemed to, be one of those kids who had my nose buried in a book or a notebook. I was trying to write stories and be a journalist when I was, under the age of 10. At primary school, I was actually identified as gifted in literacy. So when I was 15, a few years later, my sister and I together, we wrote a play that was performed by the Sydney Theatre Company, which is the sort of major artistic company here in Sydney, and won one of their youth awards. So moving on a few years, when I finished school, I actually had the marks to study law at the top university here in Sydney, the University of Sydney. Plenty of people told me that was the sensible path, including my own father, but I didn't want to do that. So I declined that opportunity. I knew that I wanted to write, so I chose to study journalism and communications instead. So over the next 20 years of my career, I moved from journalism into corporate communications, then PR, media, marketing, and eventually leadership. My job changed over those years, but my love of writing never did. It's no exaggeration for me to say that writing is something that's shaped my life. It's how I think and it's how I make sense of the world. If I'm trying to solve a problem, I usually write my way through it rather than speak my way through it. I'm not a huge fan of speaking unless I really have to. So if I'm with you on a Teams call, like if you're a client or if you're someone I'm working with, I will still write down what people are saying to keep my brain engaged, even if we've got a transcript running to capture what's being said. That's how sort of fundamental it is to the structure of my brain. It's really something personally important to me. And, like many specialists, I would actually say writing was almost a calling. Like I was never not going to end up in that sort of field. So now let me tell you what it's been like for the last few years for me since AI tools like ChatGPT and Claude arrived on the scene. So these days I routinely hear people saying things like, well, now everyone's a writer, or it doesn't matter where you get the words from. I'm going to be completely honest, as someone who cares about what I do, that hurt me a lot in the early days. Not so much now because I've seen the written output of AI with no human intervention, and I'm confident it will never match the quality of what a human can do unless something changes dramatically. But early on, I wasn't sure where it was going, and that was really scary and confronting for me. Now, here's the thing. I don't think I'm unusual in this in terms of being a specialist. I am going to say many specialists feel exactly the same way about what they do. So, you might be an artist who sketches every weekend because they can't imagine not doing that. Or you might be a musician who's been playing since you were 6 years old, or whatever it happens to be. You do it because you love doing it. You might be a software developer who started building websites as a teenager because you found it just fascinating. Or maybe you're even a scientist who spent decades chasing answers to questions most of us have never even thought to ask. For many specialists like me, your craft isn't just a profession or a passion, it's a calling. It's something you have to do. It's something you've probably been drawn to most of your life if you're a specialist. It's probably something that you practice outside work because you genuinely love it. Work just happens to be the place where you earn a living from something that you were probably going to do anyway. So here's why this matters in the context of AI or generative AI. Many of you already know this, but I'll touch on it again just in case. So today's generative AI systems are as powerful as they are because they've been trained on an enormous body of human knowledge, particularly that of people with specialist skills and subject matter expertise. So, things like books and articles, artwork, photography, music, software, scientific papers, legal analysis, all that stuff has been fed into generative AI to make it what it is today. Millions of people have spent decades, developing expertise in their craft or chosen field. And collectively, that expertise has helped make AI as capable as it is today. Now, right here, I'm going to say I'm deliberately not getting into the legal or ethical arguments of how that knowledge was collected. Those debates are happening elsewhere, and they're also being tested in courts of law at the moment. So I'm just going to leave it out of this discussion for this point in time. The point I want to make is something a little simpler. So that capability didn't appear out of nowhere. It came from somewhere. It came from people. So when I come across people online, and I come across this a lot, people making the argument that it doesn't matter how something was created, it's only the output that matters. I find it it's not offensive because I don't think anyone necessarily means to be offensive, but to be honest, it's thoughtless. And, I see this quite a bit. It's acting like provenance or where something comes from doesn't matter. And it does, because provenance matters in most every other part of our lives. So we've learned to ask where our food comes from. We're well versed in the ethical issues around human slavery and clothing supply chains, and whether the coffee we drink was fairly traded. We also think about whether diamonds are blood diamonds. We wouldn't tell someone whose labor was exploited to make a $10 cotton t-shirt from, the supermarket down the street, that it's all meaningless, because the only thing that matters is that someone over here in Australia or in America or wherever you happen to be gets a cheap t-shirt. As a society, we recognize that how the product or service was produced is just as important as anything else. Yet when it comes to AI, good people who care about these things for their food or clothing or coffee or whatever just don't seem to be thinking about where it's come from and what's gone into it. So if the output's good, who cares where it came from? So if that's what you think, I'm begging you to look at this a little differently, because I can tell you that many people with specialist skills, like me, hear that sentence very differently to what you might intend. When your life's work and something you care really deeply about has become part of the collective knowledge that powers those systems, and it's usually without your permission, hearing someone say that the source no longer matters can feel like hearing that your skills and your knowledge and everything that you've done no longer matter. So, where does that leave us? Am I asking you to stop using AI to spare the feelings of specialists? No, I am not. I am not asking anyone to stop using it. I don't actually consider myself anti-AI. I'd just like to see it introduced with more care and oversight, and with greater consideration for impacts on the environment and people. What I am asking for you, if you're using AI, is something much smaller: empathy. And I talked about this a little last week. If AI has opened up new possibilities for you because you found it hard to write or do graphic design, or you don't know how to write code or whatever it was before, that's fantastic. Just please recognize that it hasn't felt the same for everyone. Maybe for a project manager, AI might feel like a new superpower, but for someone who's spent 30 years becoming an illustrator or writer, it can feel much more complicated than that. And that's what empathy asks us to do, to recognize that our experience isn't the only valid one. So the second thing I'd like you to consider today is the issue of disclosure, and it's something I've been thinking a lot about too. So let's just say You're one of the people out there who likes to say, oh, it doesn't matter how it was produced, it's just the output that matters. If that's the case, and if AI played a significant role in creating something you've produced, then perhaps you should consider voluntarily disclosing where it came from. The same way that we expect to see where our clothes are manufactured on the label, we see made in India, or where our coffee came from on the label, or whatever. And it isn't because you've done something wrong or because using AI is cheating. It's because transparency acknowledges the process as well as the product. It would actually make you a more ethical operator. And I would prefer people to self-disclose how they've produced something. It says that you recognize things like, I know this technology didn't appear out of nowhere. I recognize that it's built on generations of human expertise. I accept that my benefit exists because someone else spent years mastering a craft. It feels like a very small gesture, but sometimes small gestures are how we show respect to others. And if you don't feel comfortable doing this, perhaps you could sit with that feeling and ask yourself why that is. Perhaps it does, after all, matter to you where that piece of content or code came from. So now, just to wrap up, last week when I spoke about empathy, I said that empathy belongs at work because it's an essential decision-making lens for leaders. So I would say AI actually compounds that imperative around empathy. So if you want to celebrate what this technology makes possible and use it enthusiastically to create things, by all means, please do so. But I hope we can also leave room for another truth, and that's the fact that behind every remarkable AI capability sits the accumulated knowledge of millions of people who devoted their lives to mastering a craft. And I don't think that's something we should forget easily. Now, if this episode has sparked something for you, I've explored the idea in more depth in this week's companion article on Substack. Whether you're listening on Substack, YouTube, or through your favourite podcast app, you can find the full piece on the publication, which is linked in the show notes. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. If you'd like more conversations about the future of work, AI, and careers, please subscribe for weekly updates. Until next time, take care.